She was lying behind a boulder the size of a pickup truck, and the blood soaking through the field dressing on her left forearm had already turned the khaki fabric a deep rust-colored brown. She did not look at it. Her right hand was pressed flat against a young man's chest, fingers splayed wide, holding a trauma dressing in place over a wound that had no business being survivable. She could feel his heartbeat through her palm. Fast. Too fast, but still there. Her radio crackled. "Doc, we've got two more tangos moving northeast along the ridgeline. We need to move." She stayed where she was. "Hartley." The voice was sharper now. "We need to." "Briggs is pinned at the eastern berm." Her voice was flat, steady. The voice of someone reading coordinates off a map rather than bleeding behind a rock while a man's life ran out beneath her hand. "He cannot move until the pressure on his left flank is reduced. Tanner teach how to shift 40 meters north and create a distraction. Not an engagement, a distraction. Draw their eyes left." A pause on the line. "Copy that." "Calloway, when Tanner moves, you have a 12-second window. You take Briggs and you move him to the tree line. Do not run. Walk fast. Running draws fire. Walking looks like cover movement. He's 200 pounds, Doc. Then you'd better start now." She adjusted the pressure on the dressing without looking down. Her eyes were moving across the terrain the way a hawk moves across an open field. Tracking, measuring, calculating distances and angles, and the particular quality of light that told her how much afternoon remained. "Reese." Her voice dropped just slightly to something that was still professional, but acknowledged the fact that he was conscious that he could hear her, that he was frightened in the way that young men who have been shot are frightened not dramatically, but deeply in the body and the place below thought. "Your heart rate is too high. I need you to breathe with me. In through the nose. Slow. Let your ribs expand." The young man tried. "Good. Again." 40 meters away, Tanner began to move. Rocks scattered. A burst of noise from the north that pulled the pressure off the eastern berm exactly as she had calculated it would. "Go, Calloway." She stayed where she was. Hand on chest, eyes on the ridge, mind running through the next 4 minutes the way a chess player runs through the next four moves, not as possibilities, but as a sequence of events already determined, already known, requiring only execution. The narrator paused here, because in 4 minutes, every single one of those men was going to walk out of that situation alive. And not one of them had walked into that morning believing she was capable of anything more than changing bandages. This is the story of how they found out they were wrong. 72 hours earlier, the road that led to Sierra Point was not on any civilian map. It cut north off Route 95 through the Nevada high desert, a single unmarked lane of cracked asphalt that wound between sage flats and basalt ridges until the mountains closed in on both sides and the air thinned enough that you noticed it. At 6,000 feet, the sky was a different color. Darker blue. Harder. The kind of sky that did not accommodate weakness. There was a gate at the end of the road, there was a guard at the gate, and there was a government-issued transport vehicle sitting at the guard post engine, still warm with one occupant, who had climbed out carrying a 60-liter pack in a manila folder and who now stood in the thin morning light, waiting for the guard to finish his phone call. She was 5'4", 118 pounds. Her hair was dark tied back in the regulation bun required of female Navy personnel in working uniform. Her eyes were a shade of green that looked almost gray in certain light and almost gold in others. Her face was the kind of face that people underestimated, not because it lacked intelligence, but because the intelligence in it was still the way deep water is still giving no indication at the surface of what the depth contained. She was reading the terrain before she even looked at the gate. Exits, angles, high ground. She did it the way other people breathe, without thinking about it. The guard finished his call and looked at her. He looked at her folder. He looked at her again. The look of a man performing arithmetic that wasn't adding up correctly. A Navy corpsman, a hospital corpsman HM2, at Sierra Point, attached to SEAL Team 7's forward training rotation. He picked up the phone again. She waited. She had been waiting for this moment for 2 years. Another 30 seconds was nothing. The gate opened. Sierra Point did not look like a military installation from the outside. It looked like a fire management station that had been expanded quietly over several decades by people who preferred that it not be noticed. Low buildings the color of surrounding rock. A motor pool behind chain link fencing. A landing pad. And beyond the central building stretching up into the mountain terrain, a training ground designed to replicate every environment that the men who trained here might encounter anywhere on Earth. She knew all of this before she arrived. She had read everything available. She had memorized the personnel roster. She had studied the terrain maps accessible through official channels and drawn her own estimates of what lay beyond those channels based on topography and logic. She knew who was here. She knew what they thought of her assignment before she had even walked through the gate. The first face she encountered after the administrative processing was a face that confirmed everything she had anticipated. He was leaning against the wall outside the chow hall, broad-shouldered, maybe 31, the kind of physical specimen that naval special warfare produced on a reliable basis, the result of years of selection and pressure, and the particular refinement that came from being tested repeatedly against genuinely high standards. His name was Briggs. PO1, Cole Briggs. She knew that from the roster. He looked at her the way the guard at the gate had looked at her. The arithmetic problem. They sent us a family doctor, he said, not to her, to the man standing next to him, Calloway P. O2 Greer, Calloway, 28 years old. 2 deployments currently the second loudest voice in a room full of loud voices. Calloway looked at her, looked at Briggs. The corners of his mouth moved. She shifted her pack on her shoulders, adjusted the medical kit at her hip, and walked through the door of the chow hall. She found a seat at the far end of the long table, back against the wall. Clear sightline to both exits and every face in the room. Her father's voice in the part of her mind where his voice had lived since she was old enough to understand it. You never sit with your back to a door. Not anywhere, not ever. She ordered her food, she ate, she listened. And while she listened, she built her understanding of the room, the way she built everything piece by piece, patient and methodical, adding variables one at a time until the picture was complete. She was still building it when Lieutenant Commander Garrett Mercer walked in. She had studied his file more carefully than anyone else's in that building. 47 years old. SEAL Team 3, then Team 7. 3 tours in Iraq, 2 in Afghanistan. The kind of service record that words like distinguished and exemplary somehow managed to undersell. He had been shot twice and had returned to active duty both times. He had lost men. He carried that loss the way men like him carried loss, not on the surface, not in anything they said, but in something behind the eyes that was always present. She had read the incident report. 2 years before she arrived at Sierra Point, a corpsman attached to Mercer's unit had frozen during a firefight. 4 seconds of paralysis. 4 seconds in which the man who needed treatment did not receive it. The man had survived. The corpsman had been reassigned. But Mercer had carried those 4 seconds ever since. She could see it in the way he looked at her when he came through the door and found her sitting at his table, that specific quality of wariness that came from a specific kind of disappointment. He sat at the head of the table, opened his own folder, said nothing. She returned to her food. The formal brief was at 0900 in the main operations room. She sat in the second row. Not the back was where people went when they wanted to be forgotten. Mercer stood at the front before a terrain map and outlined the 10-day rotation. JTAC certification exercises. Joint operations with Army elements stationed 40 miles south. Field exercises culminating in a full-scale simulated raid on day 9. He assigned roles, specific responsibilities, specific positions. Her name appeared once on the list. Medical support, primary staging area, backline. She wrote it down in her small notebook without any change in expression. In the row behind her, 1 seat to the right, she felt someone watching her write it down. Chief Wade Tanner, 44 years old. The quietest man in a room full of quiet professionals. He had the economy of movement that came from decades of genuine application, not just training, but the years of use that distilled training into something automatic, something below the level of conscious decision. She did not look back at him, but she noted him the way she noted everything that mattered, completely, for later. The brief ended, the room emptied. She capped her pen and followed. The shooting range was half a mile from the main building, cut into a natural depression in the mountain terrain that served as both backstop and sound buffer. The afternoon light was hard and flat, throwing long shadows from every protrusion in the landscape. She was not scheduled to be there. Her afternoon said medical supply inventory, which she had completed in 40 minutes because she had organized the supplies the night before. Now she stood at the edge of the range outside the designated safe zone, close enough to observe and far enough to be technically within regulations. Briggs was shooting. He was good. She acknowledged that without reservation. The way he settled into position, the way his breathing controlled itself, the way his finger moved on the trigger, these were the products of thousands of hours and genuine talent. What she was watching was not his technique. 20 yards to her left, a small patch of dry bunch grass grew at the edge of the safety line. It was moving. Not much, just enough. The wind was coming from the west-northwest, but there was a cross-current at range level she could see. In the grass, a secondary flow coming off the mountain faced to the north, deflecting down into the depression at roughly 7 degrees. Briggs was accounting for the primary wind. He was not accounting for the secondary. His groupings were good, but they were drifting fractionally to the right, maybe 2 inches at 300 meters. At 600, it would be 5 or 6. At 800, it would be enough to matter. She kept that observation to herself. Briggs glanced over his shoulder and found her standing there. "Doc." He said it carefully in the way you said a word when the word you actually wanted to use would have caused a separate problem. "The range is a little loud for someone who isn't used to it. Might want to give it some distance." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked at the grass. She took exactly 2 steps back and stood there watching the grass move, saying nothing. She felt Tanner's eyes on her from somewhere behind and to her left. She already knew he had seen her watch the grass. She knew he understood what that meant. The fact that he hadn't said anything yet was in its own way the most useful thing he could have done. It was Calloway who came in too fast and too hot from the afternoon field exercise. She saw him from 30 yards out. The slightly uneven gait, the skin color wrong even at distance, the way his head sat on his neck with a heaviness that had nothing to do with fatigue and everything to do with a core temperature that had moved past the point where water and shade solved anything. Heat stroke, not heat exhaustion. The progression past a recoverable margin. He made it to the shadow of the equipment bay before his legs began to argue with him. She was already moving. There was no time for permission. When the body's core temperature reaches a certain threshold, the window for intervention narrows to minutes. And within those minutes, there is a sequence of actions that must occur in a specific order without hesitation or error. She had rehearsed that sequence until it was structural, not something she recalled, but something she was made of. She caught him before he sat down, which would have been wrong. She guided him to the ground herself, controlling the descent, positioning him correctly. Her kit was open before he was fully settled. She took his radial pulse with 2 fingers while simultaneously checking his nail beds. Her kit was organized so that what she needed first was on top. Calloway was disoriented, not severely, but the disorientation was present, and it was information. "What's your name?" she asked him. He told her. "What day is it?" He paused. That pause told her everything she needed to confirm. She reached for the IV kit. The equipment bay threw deep shadow at this hour, and the angle of the late afternoon sun created more contrast than clarity. She did not reach for a light source. She found the vein in the crook of his elbow by touch alone. The catheter seated on the first attempt. Fluid running. She looked up and found Mercer standing 8 feet away watching. His expression was doing the thing that expressions do when a person is revising a prior assessment, not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who was not already paying close attention to his face. But she was paying attention. She returned to Calloway. His color was already beginning to change. She monitored his pulse and spoke to him in the calm, factual cadence that was not bedside manner, but something more fundamental, the voice of someone completely in control of this situation, conveying that control without overstating it, because people in medical distress were sensitive to the emotional state of whoever was treating them. They felt uncertainty the way they felt pain. They responded to calm the way they responded to oxygen. She had learned that in training. She had learned everything else from her father. Behind Mercer, Tanner's voice came low and directed only at the man in front of him. "She placed that IV without a light source, sir." Mercer said nothing. She kept her eyes on Calloway. That was enough. That evening, after the debrief and the evening meal, she went outside. She went to the edge of the cleared area north of the bunkhouse, where the mountain terrain began its upward climb, and the last light was leaving the sky. She sat on a flat rock and looked north. The ridgeline she was looking at was approximately 820 meters away. She knew because she had measured it that afternoon using reference points on the terrain map and cross-checked her estimate with the angle of shadow at 1600 hours. The wind up on that ridge was coming from the west. But there was a deflection off the north face. She could see it in the movement pattern of the scrub on the upper slope, the way vegetation on the northeastern edge moved at a slightly different timing than vegetation directly facing her. A secondary current, consistent with what she had observed at the range that afternoon. She had not been thinking about this consciously. She had just been looking. Then she heard footsteps on gravel, and Tanner sat down on a rock 6 feet to her right, and he held out a metal cup of coffee without looking at her, and she took it without looking at him. They sat in silence while the sky continued its transition, and the temperature dropped in the stepped, unambiguous way of mountain evenings. He spoke first. You've been looking at that ridge for about 10 minutes. She didn't answer. He turned slightly towards the ridge. If you needed a shot up there, you'd have to account for the west wind. Primary deflection would put your correction at roughly a 2 by 10.3 MOA. She said it the way you said something already calculated. And at 820 meters flight time is approximately 1.1 seconds, which means you're reading a wind that will shift twice before the round arrives. She heard the silence that followed. She had heard that particular silence before in herself on the day she first fully understood what her father had built in her. The silence that comes when you realize you are in the presence of something you did not expect. She set her coffee cup down and stood. "Good night, Chief." She walked back toward the bunkhouse. She could feel it, the faint, familiar sensation in her right hand, the ghost of a trigger, the memory of 1,000 mornings on a Georgia hillside with a man who was gone now, who had trusted her with something she carried in her skin. She had just told a SEAL chief petty officer the wind correction for an 820-meter shot. She had not meant to. Inside, she sat on the edge of her bunk and opened the small, zippered compartment in the front pocket of her medical kit, not the medical supplies, the personal compartment, and took out a photograph. Her father. Not in uniform. He had never let her photograph him in uniform. This was at the property in Georgia, early morning light, standing at the base of the hill, with his arms crossed, looking at something out of frame. The expression she remembered best, not the hard expression of the professional or the deliberate expression of the instructor, but the other one. The one he wore when the world was quiet and the work was good and everything was exactly as it should be. She had been 10 years old the first time he put a rifle in her hands. Not because he wanted a soldier. She understood that now, even if she hadn't understood it then. He had done it because he knew things about the world that most people preferred not to know, about the places where order ended, and something else began, about the difference between the people who survived those places and the people who did not. He had wanted her to survive anything. She put the photograph back. She pressed her palm against the right side of her ribcage through the fabric of her uniform top. The skin beneath was familiar. She had been 17 years old when he had it done, standing in a professional studio in Augusta, with her jaw set and her mind fixed on the purpose of it while the machine did its work. She had never once regretted it. Looked at quickly in the way most people looked at such things, it was unremarkable. A small design on the right side of her ribcage, the kind of thing that might appear on an identification card or a medical alert form. A blood type. A notation readable as an allergy record. A sequence readable as an emergency contact number. Standard information. Practical. The kind of thing that might save a life if she were incapacitated in the field. That was exactly what it was designed to look like. What it actually contained was something her father had told her she would understand when the time was right. Something pressed into her skin because paper could be lost and files could be altered and memory was imperfect, but skin endured. Skin went where the person went. Skin could not be intercepted. He had been a careful man, her father, careful and thorough, and possessed of a foresight that had always made her feel as a child that he was several moves ahead of every situation. She lay back on the bunk. She had promised her mother she would never pick up a rifle again. Standing in the hospital room in Augusta 14 months ago, with the machines quiet and the room holding that stillness that belongs to the hours just after something irreversible has happened, she had made that promise without being asked, because she had understood in that room all the weight her father had carried. The way service extracted something from a person that was never quite restored. The way even good men who had done necessary things came home carrying rooms inside themselves they never fully opened to anyone else. She had meant the promise. She still meant it. She closed her eyes. And somewhere in the margin between intention and the exhaustion that finally claimed her, she heard her father's voice, not a memory, not a sound, just the presence of it in the place in her mind where her clearest thinking happened. He was not saying anything in particular. He was just there. The next morning she was up before the sun. She ran 4 miles in the dark along the perimeter road because she had been running 4 miles before sunrise since she was 15, and the habit was now as structural as sleep. She ran with the economy that did not look like speed, but covered ground efficiently. At the 2-mile mark, she passed the shooting range. She looked at the grass. Still. Before dawn, before the thermals activated, the air was as neutral as it ever got up here. A small window. By 0900 it would close. She finished her run, stretched, showered, and went to the medical bay to run a full equipment check. Not because anything was likely to have changed overnight, but because the practice of checking was itself protective. It kept her hands familiar with every item and every position, so that in the moments when there was no time to think, her hands already knew. Steady hands, that was what he had always said. Steady hands save lives, Sloan. Not courage, not speed. Steady hands. The sound of the team assembling for morning brief reached her through the open window. She closed her kit, picked up her notebook, and walked out into the morning light. One step at a time. Her father's way. The only way she had ever known. The morning of day 2 began the way most consequential days begin, quietly, without announcement, with nothing in the early hours to suggest that by the time the sun reached its highest point, everything would have changed. She was in the medical bay at 0645 running her second equipment check of the morning when she heard the pre-dawn reconnaissance element return. Boots on gravel, voices lower than usual. The particular sound of a group of men who had covered ground and come back with information that was not entirely comfortable. She filed it away. At 0800, Mercer briefed the day's operation. A coordinated movement to a series of observation points across the training terrain with JT, AC elements, practicing terminal guidance procedures, and the team running position-to-position transitions under time constraints. Controlled variables, the kind of training that was demanding but bounded. Her position for the day, primary medical staging at the forward rally point designated Alpha 3, approximately 400 meters behind the line of advance. She wrote her position on the terrain sketch in her notebook. She wrote the distance from Alpha 3 to each of the team's projected stopping points. She noted the wind direction indicated by the small flags on the range visible through the window, and she noted that by the time they were in position, the thermal shift would have changed that direction by approximately 15 degrees. She closed her notebook. She was ready. They were 4 hours into the exercise when it stopped being an exercise. She felt it before she heard it, the change in radio traffic that preceded bad news. Not the words themselves, which she monitored through her earpiece. The rhythm of the words, the compression of speech that happened when professionals shifted from training mode into something older and more serious. She was at Alpha 3 when the first sharp exchange of fire came from the northeast. She was already moving to the eastern edge of the depression, kit in hand, eyes scanning the terrain ahead, before the second burst of fire confirmed what the first had suggested. The intelligence that had placed the northeastern ridge line as clear had been wrong. She did not have enough information to determine why. She needed only to respond to what was. What was contact to the northeast? Hostile fire from the ridgeline at 820 meters. Her team in a compromised position, unable to advance, unable to withdraw cleanly. She moved. The ground between Alpha 3 and the team's last known position was 230 meters of broken terrain, rock outcroppings, shallow draws, a dry creek bed that offered cover for approximately 60 of those meters. She used the creek bed. She moved at the pace that was fast enough to matter and controlled enough to avoid the recklessness that turned responders into additional casualties. She found them behind a rock formation the size of a small house. Briggs was flat against the eastern face of the largest boulder, his movements restricted by the angle of incoming fire. Calloway was 10 meters to his left in a shallow depression, functional but pinned. And Stellan Reese was down. She went to Reese first. That was the order of priority: assess the wounded, stabilize what could be stabilized, then address the tactical situation. People made the mistake of trying to do both simultaneously and did neither adequately. She reached him on her hands and knees, using ground level to stay below the sight line from the ridge. Left leg, mid-thigh. She pressed her fingers into the wound and assessed the bleeding rate in 5 seconds. Not arterial, deep muscle trauma. He was not going to bleed out in the next 10 minutes. That meant she had time to manage him, which meant he was not her first problem. Reese, she put her hand on his sternum, firm contact. I'm here. You're going to be fine. Stay exactly where you are and breathe. He looked at her with the wide eyes of a body that had received information the mind was still processing. Yes, he said. She applied a compression dressing with the speed and efficiency of someone who had done this in conditions considerably worse than a bright Nevada afternoon. Her hands did not tremble. They never did. That was the thing her father had understood before she had, that the steadiness was not something she maintained. It was something she stopped preventing. It was already in her. It had always been in her. She looked up and found Mercer. He was crouched 6 feet away watching the ridge, his expression doing the thing it did when he was running through options and not liking any of them. A radio in one hand, a rifle across his knees. The look of a commander who needed a solution he did not currently have. She looked at the ridge, 820 meters. The same ridge she had been studying the previous evening. The same wind pattern she had calculated. The secondary deflection off the north face would be fully active at this time of day, she knew, because she had been watching it since 0900 as an automatic, unthinking habit. She looked at Mercer's rifle, M24. She knew the weapon completely from study and from practice from the years on the Georgia hillside when her father had introduced her to each platform with the thoroughness of a man who believed that partial knowledge was more dangerous than no knowledge. She knew exactly what that rifle could do at 820 meters with a properly calculated correction. She looked at Mercer. Mercer looked at her, a long moment. She was aware of every component of it, the incoming fire that had slackened slightly as the shooter repositioned the clock, running on Briggs's ability to hold his position. Reese breathing steadily under her compression, dressing the wind in the scrub on the ridge, moving exactly as she had predicted it would. Mercer held out the rifle. Not a question. The action of a commander who had run the calculation and arrived at the only available answer. She looked at the rifle. She looked at the small photograph on her kit, her mother on the veranda. The Georgia morning light. Then she heard Tanner. His voice came low-positioned exactly where she had registered him earlier, just far enough back to give her space without abandoning her. "You know what to do," he said. That was all. She took the rifle. The motion that followed was not performed. It was not executed with any awareness of being observed. It was what happened when a body that had been doing something for 16 years was finally given permission to do it again. She moved into position between two rocks that offered a rest point for the bipod and a clear sight line to the ridge. Bipod. Stock to shoulder, cheek to weld, eye to scope. The ridge came into focus. Primary wind, 2.3 MOA right. Secondary deflection off the north face and additional half MOA same direction. Bullet drop at this range known. Atmospheric conditions accounted for. She breathed in, breathed out halfway, let her heart rate find its floor, squeezed the trigger. The rifle fired. The recoil was absorbed by a body that had long since made peace with it. She watched through the scope. The round struck 8 inches left of her point of aim. She knew immediately why. The wind had shifted in the 3 seconds between her final calculation and the trigger press, a brief local gust off the eastern shoulder of the ridge, unpredictable in advance, recognizable the instant it happened. She corrected. She breathed again, found the floor, squeezed. The figure on the ridge went down. She held position for 2 full seconds, confirming. Then she withdrew from the scope. "Clear," Mercer relayed to Calloway. Calloway moved to Briggs. Briggs came off the rock face and into the covered position, and the entire situation transformed in 40 seconds from something with no good options to something with a manageable path forward. She handed the rifle back to Mercer. She returned to Reese. She did not look at Briggs, who had gone very still in a way that had nothing to do with the tactical situation. She did not look at Tanner, who she was certain had not blinked in 90 seconds. She looked at Reese, checked his dressing, and told him he was going to need about 8 stitches and would have a scar he could tell inaccurate stories about for the rest of his life. Reese laughed, the short, disbelieving laugh of someone still recalibrating. She adjusted his dressing. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. The debrief was at 1400 hours at the equipment bay. She sat in her usual position and waited. The room was quieter than it had been at any point since her arrival. Briggs was standing against the far wall with his arms crossed and had not said anything since they came off the mountain. Calloway had looked at her twice during the walk back. Not the look from the first morning, but the look of someone revising an equation they believed they had already solved. Mercer ran the debrief with his standard precision. He covered the sequence of events, the intelligence failure, the tactical decisions, the outcomes. When he reached the point in the sequence where her name appeared, he paused briefly, professionally, and said, "Petty Officer Hartley eliminated the hostile position at 820 meters under field conditions. The team was able to reestablish movement as a result." That was all he said. It was enough. Briggs uncrossed his arms. His jaw was working through the calculation that his mouth had not yet finished. Then he arrived at the other side of it. "Where did you learn that?" Not aggressive, not the tone from the first morning. A genuine question, which was its own kind of concession. She looked at him steadily. "My father taught me." "Who was your father?" "Gunnery Sergeant Earl Hartley, Marine Force Recon. He died in 2019. The room absorbed that. She added nothing. There was nothing to add. She stood when Mercer released them and walked directly to the medical bay to check on Reese, who needed his dressing changed and his stitches inspected, and the kind of straightforward, uncomplicated attention that was the core of what she did. She heard Tanner say something to Mercer behind her as she left. She could not make out the words, but she knew what direction they were moving. It was Mercer who made the call to Bupers that evening. She knew because Tanner told her not as news, but in the manner of someone ensuring she was not surprised by what came next. He found her in the medical bay after evening chow, sitting at the small desk completing patient notes on Reese, whose vitals were stable and whose appetite had returned with the conviction of someone recently reminded that appetite was not guaranteed. Tanner sat down on the equipment chest opposite her desk and was quiet for a moment, as was normal for him. Commander Mercer submitted a background inquiry to Bupers this afternoon, he said. Your records prior to your 18th birthday came back restricted. Her pen kept moving across the page. Need to know classification, Tanner continued. The authorization signature on the restriction order. I know whose signature it is, she said. A pause. Rear Admiral Hollister, she said. She said the name quietly without particular emphasis. The way you said a name you had been expecting to say for a long time. Tanner looked at her with the careful attention he brought to everything significant. My father served with Admiral Hollister, she said. Fallujah, November 2004. The restriction order was placed in 2019, the same month my father died. She said it plainly. The grief had not gone anywhere, she had no illusions about that. But she had learned to work alongside it the way experienced navigators worked alongside strong currents, using its presence rather than fighting it, maintaining direction through the resistance rather than pretending the resistance did not exist. It was there, it always would be. That was not the same as being defeated by it. Tanner was quiet for a long moment. Why would Hollister restrict your juvenile records after your father died? She looked at him. She considered how much to say and decided on the honest answer because Tanner had earned it not through any single dramatic gesture, but through the consistent small choices he had made since she arrived. He had positioned himself as neither advocate nor obstacle, but something more useful, a person who saw accurately and acted accordingly. To protect something, she said, or to protect me until I was in the right place to carry it forward. She stood and filed her patient notes. I don't have all of it yet, but I'm getting closer. She turned off the desk lamp. Good night, Chief. She waited until the base was quiet. She sat on her bunk with the small zippered compartment open on her lap, the photograph already looked at and replaced. Beneath it in the flat bottom of the compartment was an envelope. Standard letter size. The paper had been folded and unfolded enough times over the past 14 months that the creases were soft, almost worn through at the intersections. Her name on the front in the handwriting that had appeared on birthday cards and permission slips and notes she used to find in her lunch bag when she was 12, and the world was still a manageable size. She did not need to open it. She knew every word. She opened it anyway because some things were meant to be read rather than remembered, because the physical act carried something that pure recall could not replicate. Her father had written it in the hospital earlier in the progression of his illness, while precision remained in the movement of his pen. He told her directly without softening, with the respect of someone who assumed she was capable of receiving difficult information, that there were things about his service he had never been able to share. Not because he had wanted to keep them from her, though, because they were not his alone to tell. He told her about Fallujah, about November 2004, about a situation that had required two men to make a decision that could not be reviewed through normal channels. About Frank Hollister, who had stood beside him in that moment and had never wavered, and who was still serving, and who was, as of the date of the letter, the only other person alive who knew the complete version of what had happened and what it meant. He told her that he had built a record, not a weapon, a precise and complete account, encoded in a way designed to survive him and arrive when the moment was right in the hands of someone who could be trusted to do the right thing with it. He told her where the record was. She pressed her palm against the right side of her ribcage through the fabric of her uniform top. She had always known. She read to the end of the letter the lines she had read 100 times and that still landed differently each time. He had written, I did not teach you to fight. I taught you to be effective. Those are not the same thing. The day you understand why I taught you both, you will know what to do next. She folded the letter, put it back, pressed the zipper closed. She lay back and looked at the ceiling. Hollister's name on a restriction order dated the month her father died. The path between that fact and this room was shorter than it had appeared from the beginning. She was close. She closed her eyes. The third morning, 4 miles in the dark, the perimeter road, the same pace. At the 2-mile mark, she passed the range and looked at the grass, still, the pre-dawn window before the thermals activated. By 0900 it would close. She finished her run, stretched against the equipment bay wall, and looked at her hands. The same hands that had placed an IV without a light source. The same hands that had packed a wound and given a young man a future he had been about to lose. The same hands that had held an M24 at 820 meters and had missed by 8 inches on the first attempt because the wind changed and had corrected and had not missed again. She had never thought of herself as two different things. Her father had made sure of that. The second engagement came at 11:30 hours. A deliberate position, a mobile target operating in open terrain to the north, simulating a scenario the unit would realistically face operationally. The target was moving. The range was 1,150 meters. The wind at ground level was coming from the west at approximately 12 miles per hour with the secondary deflection off the north face, adding complexity to the calculation. And she had taken a fragment in her left shoulder. From a secondary detonation, a charge that was part of the training scenario, and that had been triggered at the wrong moment. The fragment was small. She had assessed it herself in 30 seconds. Not life-threatening, bleeding controlled, partial use of the arm, full function in the hand. She dressed it with one hand, and her teeth noted the discomfort and moved it to a part of her mind she knew how to close and kept moving. When Mercer came to her position and saw the dressing on her shoulder, his expression moved through several things quickly. "We can handle the position," he said, the offer of a man choosing his words with care. She was already looking at the target through the scope of the rifle she was holding. 1,150 meters, moving at approximately 4 miles per hour on a heading that had changed twice in the last 3 minutes. The bipod was not useful here, the ground angled wrong, and her left arm's limited range made the standard supported position unavailable. She would need to brace against the rock face to her right, shooting off her right shoulder in a modified position. An imperfect configuration requiring a different set of compensations. Harder by any objective measure. "Hartley," Mercer said, "I said we can—" "I have the shot, sir." She said it as a statement of fact, not defiance, not performance, just the declaration of something already decided. Mercer was quiet. She settled against the rock face. Right shoulder, stock placement adjusted for the modified position. Cheek weld established. The target moved through her crosshairs. She ran the calculation. 1,150 meters. Wind allowance for the primary vector. Correction for the secondary deflection. Bullet drop. The moving target required a lead approximately 4 feet at this range and speed adjusted for the angle of movement relative to her position. She breathed, found the floor, squeezed. 1 round. The target went down. She held position for 2 seconds. Confirmed. Then she set the rifle down and rolled her left shoulder, carefully testing whether the fragment had shifted. It had not. She was reaching for her own medical kit to check the dressing when she became aware of Briggs behind her. She had been aware of him since before the shot, Tanner to her left, Calloway behind, and Wright Briggs directly behind at approximately 15 feet. She was always aware of everyone in the space around her. Briggs was standing with his arms at his sides. The crossed arms had not reappeared since the first shot on the mountain, and something in the way he was standing told her they would not return. He looked at her shoulder. He looked at the rifle on the ground. He looked at the target position 1,150 meters away. His mouth opened. Then it closed. The arithmetic again, but a different order of magnitude than before. She picked up the rifle and handed it to Mercer. "I'll need to clean the dressing when we get back," she said. "The fragment may need to come out in better light. Shouldn't be more than a 20-minute procedure." Mercer took the rifle and held it for a moment without moving. He looked at her in the way of a man processing several things simultaneously and choosing which of them to say. He settled on the most direct. "Copy that." She picked up her kit. Tanner fell in beside her as she started walking back, matching her pace, saying nothing. The particular companionship of someone who communicated in presence rather than words. She had known a small number of people like that. Her father had been one of them. After about 200 meters, Tanner said without looking at her, "Briggs hasn't said anything in 40 minutes. She kept walking. "That's a new record," he said. "Previous best was 22 minutes after Calloway beat him in a timed 2-mile last spring." She walked for another 100 meters. "He'll find his words," she said. Tanner glanced at her briefly. "I expect he will." The Nevada sun sat hard and bright above them, and as they walked, the wind moved through the scrub around their feet. And somewhere 18 miles to the south, a decision was already in motion. Set in motion long before this day, long before this installation, long before a woman with steady hands and a letter in her kit and a mark on her skin had walked through a gate at the end of an unmarked road and waited for the arithmetic to resolve itself. She was almost at the end of the path. She could feel it the way she felt weather changes, without looking, without thinking, just knowing. The call came at 13:47 hours. She was in the medical bay working on her shoulder under better light when the radio traffic changed. She had learned to read that traffic the way she read terrain, not for the specific content of individual transmissions, but for the overall pattern, the rhythm, the quality of urgency that existed beneath the words. The pattern changed at 1347. She put down the instrument she was using, pressed a clean dressing against the sight and secured it, and was at the door of the medical bay before the first relay came through the installation's internal frequency. She listened. Stellan Reese had been discharged from overnight medical observation at 0600 that morning against her recommendation and with the attending chief's reluctant sign-off on the grounds that his wound was stable and his vitals were acceptable. She had told him to rest. She had been specific. He had nodded in the way that 22-year-old men nodded when they had already decided to do the opposite, and by 0730 he had attached himself without formal authorization to the forward observation element operating in the terrain 18 miles south of the main installation. The forward observation element had moved into a position that subsequent intelligence had determined was already occupied. Reese was being held. She absorbed this information without allowing it to become panic, because panic was a physiological state that degraded the precise function she was going to need in the next several hours. She redirected that current of energy into something colder and more useful. She had been doing that for most of her adult life. She repacked her kit in 45 seconds. A modified layout reorganized for the specific priorities of penetrating abdominal trauma, which was the category of injury most likely to result from the situation being described. She added a second hemostatic dressing, a second set of IV materials, and a larger gauge catheter for central access placed in the front pocket, where she could reach it with either hand. She was at the motor pool in 3 minutes. Mercer was already there. He looked at her kit. He looked at her shoulder. He said nothing about either. She got in the vehicle. The terrain between the main installation and the forward observation position was the kind that looked straight forward on a map and proved on contact to be neither. Rock formations unrepresented at map scale, draws that appeared shallow from above and were deep enough to conceal a vehicle once you were in them, ground surface alternating between solid basalt and loose shale without warning. She sat in the passenger seat and watched it all with her mind already split down the middle, one half mapping the approach routes and angles of observation from the surrounding high ground, the other half running the medical clock. The two processes did not compete with each other. They never had. She knew what abdominal trauma meant in the field. Without surgical resources, the window for effective intervention in a perforating abdominal wound was measured in single-digit hours. If a major vessel was involved, it narrowed to minutes. She would know the specifics when she could assess. The assessment would drive everything else. The vehicle stopped at the last covered position before open ground. She got out. Mercer laid out what they had. The forward observation post was in a shallow rock formation at the base of a long slope. 300 meters of open ground between their current position and Reese. Two individuals holding the position had established themselves at elevation to the east and west, controlling both approaches. They were equipped and patient and had not made any aggressive move toward Reese in the 40 minutes since the situation developed. That window would not stay open indefinitely. Tanner was already moving right without discussion, without formal assignment. He had assessed the situation and identified his role before anyone spoke. He would take the eastern elevated position. That left the western position. She looked at it, 680 meters, slightly elevated. The shooter there had positioned himself well cover on three sides, clear sightline to the approach. The only viable angle was from the southwest, from exactly where she was standing. She held out her hand. Mercer looked at her hand, looked at her shoulder, looked at the 680 meters between them and the post. She held her hand where it was. He gave her the rifle. She found a position behind a rock formation that gave her a stable rest in the southwest angle. She settled in. Wind at this elevation angle of descent from her position to target quality of afternoon light with its slight thermal shimmer at distance manageable at this range was 180 meters. Cleaner conditions than either previous shot, more stable position despite the shoulder. She breathed. She fired. The western position went silent. 30 seconds later, to the east, so did Tanner's. The approach was open. She ran the 300 meters. The kit moved against her hip. The shoulder sent its message with each stride steady and insistent. She filed it in the compartment she knew how to close and opened that compartment again when she needed to. She reached Reese in under 90 seconds. He was conscious. He knew her name when she said it. His eyes were tracking correctly. The shock had not yet progressed beyond the manageable range. The wound was in the right upper quadrant of the abdomen. She assessed it systematically, both hands doing different things simultaneously, because that was the most efficient use of available time. She pressed her fingers into the wound margin. Deep. The tract extended past the external oblique into the abdominal cavity. She could feel the warmth beyond the muscle layer and made her determination with the clarity of someone who had studied this specific scenario until the knowledge was structural. Perforating wound. High contamination risk. Significant internal bleeding. Not immediately fatal at current rate, but that rate was not static. She spoke to Reese in the flat, certain voice she used when she needed complete trust established in 3 seconds. I'm going to pack this wound. It will be painful. I need you to stay as still as you can. Yes, Reese said. She worked. Hemostatic gauze packed into the wound cavity with controlled pressure precise enough to be effective, restrained enough to avoid additional damage. She monitored his pulse as she worked radial with the fingers of her left hand while her right managed the packing. The pulse was fast, not catastrophically so, but moving in the wrong direction. She needed IV access. She checked his arms. The peripheral veins were already beginning to collapse, the early sign of volume depletion, the body redirecting resources inward. A peripheral line at this stage would be marginal. She reached for the front pocket of her kit, the larger gauge catheter she had packed specifically for this. She found the external jugular vein at the right side of his neck. The landmark was clear to someone who knew exactly what they were looking for. She had known for a long time. She placed the catheter. First attempt. The vein accepted it cleanly. Fluid running. She looked at her watch. 8 minutes 40 seconds since she reached him. The window she had been working against was 40 minutes from onset. They had time. Not comfortable time, but time. She was adjusting the flow rate on the IV line when the movement registered in her peripheral vision. To the east, on the slope above the forward post. A third individual either missed in the initial assessment of the position, or arrived after it, or positioned specifically to remain unobserved until a moment of tactical opportunity presented itself. The third individual was moving toward a position that would give clear sightline to the approach where Mercer and Calloway were currently moving. Both of them in open ground between cover positions at a moment when running would expose them further. She looked at the distance. Her eye had been calibrating ranges for 16 years without conscious effort. 90 meters, perhaps 95. Moving and would be in position in less than 20 seconds. She looked at the rifle, 6 feet to her left, where she had placed it when she transitioned to medical work. She looked at Reese. She looked at her kit. She made her assessment the way she made all assessments, not by choosing between two values, but by identifying the action that served both simultaneously. Because the premise that she had to choose was the false premise. It was the limitation people imposed on situations that were more solvable than they appeared. She adjusted the IV line so it would run without active management for 30 seconds. She pressed the trauma dressing against the packed wound. Hold this, firm even pressure. Don't let go. Okay, Reese said. She drew the Beretta M9 from the holster on her right thigh. Her left hand stayed on Reese's forearm, fingers wrapped around his pulse point. Monitoring, the hand that was doing the medical work did not stop doing the medical work. Her right hand brought the pistol up. 90 meters, the individual on the slope was almost in position. She breathed in, breathed out, fired. 1 round, the individual on the slope went down. She reholstered the Beretta, returned her left hand to the wound site, checked the dressing, checked the IV flow, checked Reese's pulse. Holding. She looked up. Mercer was standing at the edge of the post, having covered the last 50 meters at a run when the shot broke. He was looking at her. His expression was the expression of a man who had seen a great many things and who was being asked in this moment to integrate something that required a reconfiguration of several operating assumptions. Tanner stood beside him. Tanner was looking at her hands, at her left hand, which was monitoring Reese's pulse, at her right hand, which had just holstered a pistol. He said it quietly in the manner of a man who had understood something and was giving it words for the person standing next to him. Both hands, sir. He paused. She used both hands. Mercer said nothing for a long moment. He looked at Reese, at the slope where the third individual had gone down, at the 2 elevated positions that were no longer active, and the open approach that had been made possible, and the young man on the ground with a properly placed central IV line and a packed abdominal wound and a pulse that was holding against the odds. Then he looked at her. She was not looking at him. She was looking at Reese, monitoring his color, watching his breathing rate, her hands doing what they had always done and what they would always do. Steady, the medevac arrived 41 minutes later. She rode with Reese to the regional trauma center because he was not yet stable enough for handoff without continuity of care and because there was no argument from anyone that she was the most qualified person to maintain that continuity. She sat in the back of the helicopter with her hand on his arm and her eyes on the monitor, making small adjustments, noting small changes, doing the work that needed to be done with the same measured efficiency she had brought to everything since arriving at Sierra Point 3 days ago. Reese looked at her at some point during the flight. He had been in and out of full alertness as adrenaline metabolized and pain settled in. "Doc, I'm here. You shot someone." "I did." He processed that. "While you were, yes." He was quiet. The helicopter moved through the late afternoon sky. Below them, the Nevada terrain was turning gold in the declining light, shadows lengthening the mountains, showing their true scale from altitude, and immense and indifferent and beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they have no interest in being observed. "My dad was a medic," Reese said. His voice was slower now, the good kind of slower. "He always said the job was keeping people alive. That was it. Everything else was secondary." She looked at him. "He was right," she said. Reese looked at the ceiling. "I should have gone back to the bunkhouse." "Yes," she said. "You should have. Will you tell me I was an idiot?" "You were an idiot." Something happened in his face that was close to a smile. "Okay," he said. "Okay." She adjusted the IV flow. She kept her hand on his arm and looked out the window at the Nevada sky and thought about what her father had written and what Tanner had said and what was waiting for her when she got back to Sierra Point. She was ready. Rear Admiral Frank Hollister arrived at Sierra Point at 2100 hours. She knew before anyone told her. She had returned from the trauma center at 1930 after handing Reese over to the surgical team with a complete clinical summary that the receiving physician reviewed twice before looking up at her with an expression she recognized as reassessment. She had gone to the medical bay, repacked her kit, and changed her own dressing in the better light of the bay while the base settled into its evening routine around her. She was at her desk completing patient notes when she heard the additional vehicle on the approach road and then the particular quality of activity in the main building that accompanied the arrival of a flag officer, a subtle but perceptible intensification of order. Small adjustments in bearing, the kind of unconscious recalibration that rank produced in the people surrounding it. She finished the sentence she was writing, capped her pen, sat for a moment with her hand resting flat on the desk. Then she stood, buttoned the top button of her uniform top, picked up her notebook, and walked to the main building. The operations room held 7 people when she entered, Mercer at the front, Tanner to his right, Briggs and Calloway against the wall, 3 other team members. And at the head of the briefing table, standing with his back to the door when she came in and turning as she entered, a man she had never seen in person, but whose face she would have known anywhere. 63 years old, 6 feet. The gray hair cut close, regulation silver at the temples and white at the crown. The face had the quality of faces shaped by decades of serious weather and serious circumstance. Not hard exactly, but settled the way stone settles after the elements have worked it into its final form. The uniform carried the insignia of a rear admiral, and the ribbons above the left breast pocket told a long story by themselves. He turned when she entered and looked at her with the particular attention of a man who had been waiting to look at something for a very long time. She stopped inside the door. "Petty Officer Hartley," he said, not a question. "Yes, sir." "Earl Hartley's daughter." "Yes, sir." He looked at her for a moment with something in his expression that was not sentiment. Sentiment was too soft a word for what it was, but that acknowledged duration, a span of years. The distance between the day a decision was made and the day its consequences finally arrived. "He told me about you," Hollister said. "Before he died, he called me. We spoke for about 40 minutes. He paused. "It was the last real conversation I had with him." The room was very quiet. She held his gaze. She did not fill the silence. "He told me what he had built," Hollister said, "and he told me where he had put it, and he told me that when the time was right, I would know." He looked at her steadily. "I think the time is right." She set her notebook on the table. She reached up with both hands and undid the top 3 buttons of her uniform top. The motion was unhurried, deliberate, the opposite of performative, the action of someone who had been waiting for this moment and was now arriving at it with the full weight of everything that had led to it. She opened the fabric to the right, exposed the right side of her ribcage. She heard the room change. Not a sound, an absence of sound. The specific silence that fell when everyone in a space was experiencing the same moment of recalibration simultaneously. The tattoo was small and precise. At a glance, in the way most people glanced at things, it was entirely unremarkable. A medical information design, the kind that appeared on identification cards and intake forms and the inside covers of field medical guides. A blood type, a notation that could be read as an allergy record, a sequence that could be read as an emergency contact number. Standard information, the kind of thing you categorized and moved past because the familiar did not demand attention. Hollister stepped forward. He looked at it the way you look at something you encountered long ago in a very different context. The way you look at a language you learned young and have not used in years and find to your own surprise that you still know it completely. His eyes moved across the design. Not all of it, not the portions that were exactly what they appeared to be. He was looking at a specific sequence of characters embedded in the larger design with a craft that required prior knowledge to locate. The kind of work that hid in plain sight specifically because the eye passed over it in search of something that looked like a secret. She watched his face. She saw the moment he found it. He went very still. He looked at it for several seconds without speaking. Then he looked up at her. "Do you know what this contains?" he asked. "He didn't tell me the specifics," she said. "He told me it was a record, something that needed to survive him and reach the right person at the right time." Hollister nodded slowly. He turned to address the room, and when he spoke, his voice had shifted, the same voice, the same measured cadence, but carrying a different weight now. The weight of a man moving from one register of truth to another. "What I'm about to tell this room does not leave it without my direct authorization." The room was already still. It became stiller. In November 2004, Gunnery Sergeant Earl Hartley and I were part of a small element operating in the Fallujah area during the second major offensive. During that operation, we encountered a cache that existed in no briefing document, no intelligence summary, no official record of any kind. He paused. The pause was not for effect. It was the pause of a man being precise about something that required precision. Biological materials, precursor compounds already synthesized, in a quantity and state of preparation that indicated intended deployment, not storage. The assessment we made on site based on volume synthesis stage and projected delivery method indicated a conservative casualty estimate of 30,000 lives in a populated target, possibly 3 times that under optimal conditions for the attacker. He let that number occupy the room. 30,000 lives, possibly 90,000. We had no way to secure it through normal channels without the information reaching people. We had specific operational reasons not to trust at that time. Your father made a complete record of the location, the contents, the access route. He encoded it in the cipher we had developed specifically for that operation, a system known only to the two of us. He looked at the tattoo on her ribcage, and then he put it somewhere safe. He turned back to her. That cache has not been recovered. For 20 years, it has sat in a location known to no living person in any official capacity. The political situation in the region has changed enough in the past 3 years that recovery is now operationally feasible, but it requires precise location data that exists nowhere in any official record. He looked at her directly. "It exists on your skin. Because your father trusted you with the most important thing he ever knew, and he trusted you to be the kind of person who would find the right moment to bring it to the right person." He was quiet for a moment. He was not wrong. The silence in the room had acquired a different quality now. The quality of people understanding the full dimensions of something they had previously been seeing only a corner of. She thought about what her father had written, about the decision that could not be reviewed through normal channels, about the thing he had built and where he had placed it, about the day she would be standing in the right place. She had been in the right place since she was 17 years old. She had simply needed to walk far enough to find the person who could receive it. Hollister turned to Mercer. "I want a full documentation and extraction protocol initiated immediately. Petty Officer Hartley is the primary source. She will be treated not as attached medical support, but as an essential operational asset, which is what she has been since she arrived at this installation, whether or not that fact was adequately recognized." Mercer looked at her. Something had shifted in his face, not dramatically, not in a way that would have been visible in a photograph, but visible to her because she had been reading faces the way she read terrain for most of her life. "You're right, sir," he said. He held her gaze. "You should have been treated that way from the first morning." "I should have seen it sooner." She held his gaze in return. "You saw what you had reason to see," she said. "Now you have more reason." The room began to move. Hollister directing Tanner, already thinking through operational logistics, Bobby reaching for his notepad. The machinery of consequence engaging. And then Briggs spoke. He had been standing against the wall through the entire exchange, the same arms at his sides posture he had adopted since the first shot on the mountain. He spoke now in the voice of a man who had arrived somewhere through a longer and more difficult route than he had anticipated, and who was choosing to acknowledge that route rather than pretend it had not been traveled. Doc, she looked at him. Day one, the chow hall. I was loud about it and I was wrong about it, and you deserved better from the first minute you walked through that gate. He held her gaze without flinching from it. I'm sorry. He said it plainly. No performance, no hedging, no attempt to soften it into something easier. The directness of someone who had decided that the most professional thing available was to say the thing that was true. She looked at him for a moment. Not the evaluating look from the first morning. Something simpler than that. You didn't know what you didn't know, she said. That's not a character flaw. That's just a starting point. Something settled in his face. The large, long arithmetic finally arriving at its answer. Yeah, he said, it is. She buttoned her uniform top. She picked up her notebook from the table. She was ready to begin. She found a moment alone at 2300 hours. She went outside to the flat rock at the edge of the cleared area north of the bunkhouse. The same rock as the first evening. The Nevada night was cold and clear and complete. The temperature dropped without apology, and the sky opening overhead into a depth of stars possible only at altitude, away from the noise and light of the inhabited world. She looked at the ridge. In the darkness, it was only a mass of black against the stars, but she knew exactly where it was. She knew its distance and angle, and the way the wind moved across its face at every hour of the day. She knew it the way she knew the important things completely, from the kind of attention that was really a form of respect. She took out her phone. She looked at it for a moment. She called her mother. 3 rings. Her mother answered on the 4th, which was her mother's habit, the precisely calibrated response of a woman who had spent decades navigating the balance between available and waiting. Sloan. Hi, Mom. A brief pause. Her mother was a reader of pauses. She had been married for 31 years to a man who communicated more in silence than in words. You sound different, her mother said. I'm okay. I wanted you to know I'm okay. Are you hurt? She touched her shoulder briefly. Nothing serious, managed. Her mother absorbed this. I picked up a rifle again, she said. I know I said I wouldn't. I need you to understand I didn't do it lightly, and I didn't do it without thinking about you. But there were people who needed Sloan. She stopped. Her mother's voice was quiet, not upset, not reproachful. The voice of a woman who had made a particular peace with a particular kind of life over a long time with difficulty, and who had arrived on the other side of that process with something more durable than happiness and more honest than resignation. Your father came home from every deployment, her mother said, and every time for the first few days he would sit in the kitchen very early in the morning before anyone else was up. He would drink his coffee and just sit. I used to think he was sad, but one morning I asked him and he said no. She paused. He said he was grateful. He said there was something about coming home to an ordinary kitchen with ordinary light through the window that he needed to sit well for a few days before he could let himself be ordinary again. She sat on the rock in the Nevada darkness and said nothing. He would be grateful tonight, her mother said, for wherever you are and whatever you did to get there. That's what I know. She pressed her palm against her right side through the fabric of her jacket. The skin beneath was unchanged. The design was what it had always been, small and precise, readable only to the people who knew what to look for. The information it had contained was now somewhere else in the hands of people who could use it the way her father had intended, from the day he understood he could not use it himself. I think he knew I'd end up here, she said. I know he did, her mother said simply. He told me. They talked for a few more minutes. Her mother's garden, a program she had started watching. Small, ordinary things that were their own necessity, proof that the world continued to contain them. She said goodnight. She sat for a while longer with the stars and the ridge and the wind moving through the sage, and she pressed her palm against her right side one more time, the place where the important thing had lived in her skin for a decade. Steady hands, her father's voice said, from wherever voices went. She looked at her hands. They were the same hands they had always been. 6 months later, the Naval Amphibious Base at Coronado sat at the edge of a peninsula that jutted into San Diego Bay, and in the early morning the light off the water was the kind of light that made the world look as though it had been recently reassembled, everything clean and sharp-edged and possible. She ran her 4 miles before sunrise, as she always did, along the perimeter road that skirted the water. The cold came off the bay in the coastal way, not the dry blade of Nevada mountain cold, but something with more substance, something that required movement through it rather than simply endurance of it. She finished her run. She stretched. She showered. She looked in the mirror the way she looked in mirrors, practically checking for anything requiring attention. The circles under her eyes that had been present at Sierra Point were gone. She had been sleeping consistently for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure. She had put back the weight lost in the months before Sierra Point, when the task ahead had consumed the kind of energy that eating was supposed to replenish, but couldn't when the task was large enough. She looked like herself. She had not always in the years since her father died. She dressed, gathered her materials, and walked across the base in the morning light to the building where 18 people were waiting. The classroom had been configured as she had requested, a horseshoe arrangement, everyone facing the center, no position of clear precedence, except the board at the front where she wrote the things that needed to be written. 18 faces, corpsmen and medics from 6 different units, 2 Army, 4 Navy, 1 Marine, service time ranging from 8 months to 11 years, experience from the purely theoretical to the thoroughly operational. What they shared was that they had been selected by a process beginning with a recommendation from Admiral Hollister, formalized by the Bureau of Medicine and Surgery, with a speed suggesting someone at a significant level had decided this mattered and said so clearly. She stood at the front and looked at the faces. In the front row, first seat on the left, sat Stellan Reese. He had been discharged from the trauma center after 9 days faster than the surgical team initially projected, a pace he had accelerated by being, in the words of the charge nurse, the most motivated and most exhausting patient they had ever managed. Full recovery. The scar on his abdomen was the kind he was already developing stories about. He had requested transfer to the course as a teaching assistant within 48 hours of discharge. The request had been approved, which was by the standards of military bureaucracy nearly instantaneous. He caught her eye when she looked at him and nodded slightly, not with the expression of someone who felt they owed her something, but with the expression of someone who understood exactly what they were doing there and why. On the board behind her, written in her own hand in black marker before the first person arrived, "Heal when you can, fight when you must, never choose between." She had written those words because they were true, because they were her father's understanding, filtered through her own experience, arrived at through a process that had taken 27 years and required everything she had. She had written them because she was a teacher now. And teaching meant taking what you knew and giving it away as completely and accurately as you could, because the value of what you knew was not in its possession, but in its transmission. "Good morning," she said, a response from the room. "I'm Petty Officer 2nd Class Sloan Hartley. I'm a hospital corpsman HM2, attached to Naval Special Warfare Command. Most of you have read the course description." A brief pause. "Forget the course description. I'll tell you what this course actually is." The room was attentive with the particular quality of attention given by professionals who have been promised something real. For most of your careers, you have been trained in one of two things. Some of you have been trained to heal. Some of you have been trained to fight. The division exists because it has always existed, because the institutional habit of specialization is strong, and because in many contexts it is correct. She let that sit for a moment. This course exists because there are contexts in which it is not correct. Contexts in which the choice between your two functions, the choice your training has taught you to make in advance, is a false choice. And making a false choice in those contexts costs lives. She looked at the faces. You will not leave this course as better fighters or as better healers. You will leave it as people who understand that the division between those two things is a construct, and that the construct can be set aside when the situation demands it, and that the ability to set it aside comes from a specific kind of preparation we are going to build in you over the next 16 days. A hand in the third row, a young corpsman who carried herself with the controlled intensity of someone who had been waiting to be in exactly this room. "Why both?" the young woman asked. "Why does it have to be both? Why can't someone else handle the tactical element so we can focus on PUM?" "Because sometimes," Sloan said, "there is no one else." She looked at the young woman directly, not harshly, the way her father had looked at her when she asked a question that had a real answer and deserved to receive it. The person who needs you is the person in front of you. The threat to that person is the threat in front of you. The space between those two things is the space where you live. Someone else handling the tactical element is a resource that may or may not be present, and your ability to function cannot be contingent on a resource that may or may not be present. The young woman held her gaze for a moment. Then she nodded slowly. Not the nod of someone satisfied, but the nod of someone who had received something they were going to have to sit with for a while. That's the answer, Sloan said. To most of the questions you're going to have over the next 16 days, that's the answer. What do you do when the resource isn't there? What do you do when you are the only resource? What do you do with both hands? She turned to the board. She picked up the marker. She wrote two words beneath the three lines already there. Smaller. A subtitle. The instruction beneath the principle. Steady hands. She set the marker down. She turned back to the room. Let's begin. 3 months after the first cohort completed the course, the Bureau of Medicine and Surgery issued a formal request for curriculum development that would bring the integrated combat medicine program to 4 additional installations across 3 states. The request cited operational outcomes data. It cited the documented case studies Reese had helped her compile over the previous months, each one a situation in which the integrated approach had produced an outcome that the specialized approach would not have. Each one a life or several lives measured against a choice that had not needed to be made. In the summary section of the request attributed to a flag officer's endorsement letter was a phrase that had apparently begun traveling through the language of people who trained people who kept other people alive in very difficult places. The phrase was "drag them out alive." She heard it first from Reese on a Tuesday morning after the second cohort's third session, when he came into the small office the base had given her and said it the way things were said when they had already traveled some distance from their origin naturally, as though they had always existed. "That's what they're calling it at the other units," he said. "The approach, the philosophy, whatever you want to call it. Drag them out alive." She looked at him. She thought about a young man on the ground in an open rock formation in the Nevada high desert, an IV line in his jugular vein placed by a woman whose other hand had just fired a pistol at 90 meters while her left hand monitored a pulse. She thought about what her father had written, about the difference between fighting and being effective, about the things she had been taught and the things she had become, and the distance between those two processes that was not in the end very much distance at all. "It's accurate," she said. "It's more than accurate," Reese said. "It's what happens when people actually understand what you're teaching." He said it without flattery, in the flat declarative tone of someone reporting an observation. She had come to trust that tone. She thought about the 18 faces, about the young woman in the third row, about the things that would now live in those people and travel with them to places she would never be, and operate in situations she would never see, and reach people she would never meet. That was the legacy her father had told her about. Not the shots on the mountain, which would be remembered by the people who had been there. Not even the cipher, which had been extracted and transmitted and was now part of a recovery operation being conducted in rooms she was not in by people with the authority and resources to do something with it that her father had spent 20 years hoping someone would eventually do. The shots would be remembered, but the teaching would go further. That evening, she sat at her desk in the small office and wrote a letter. Short. The kind her father had always preferred, direct, no more words than the thought required. She addressed it to her mother. She wrote that she was well. She wrote about the course and about Reese, and about the phrase that had found its way into the language of the people who did this work. She wrote that she thought about Georgia often, the flat early light and the hill and the smell of pine and the weight of the rifle that had been too large for her hands at 10 years old and that her hands had grown into over the years that followed. She wrote that she understood now why her father had done what he had done. All of it. Not just the cipher and the training, but the whole architecture, the way he had raised her, and what he had built in her, and the patience with which he had trusted the future to arrive at the moment he had prepared for. She wrote that she was grateful. She sealed the letter. She put it with the others that would go out in the morning. She sat for a moment in the quiet of the office with the San Diego night outside the window, and the bay reflecting the lights of the city, and the sound of the bass settling into its evening rhythm all around her. She pressed her palm against the right side of her ribcage. The skin was unchanged. The design was what it had always been. The information it had contained was now somewhere else in the hands of people who could use it the way it had been meant to be used. Doing the work her father had intended it to do from the day he had understood he could not do that work himself. She was what remained. She understood now what he had always intended to remain. She turned off the desk lamp. She put on her jacket. The second cohort's briefing was at 0800 the next morning. 16 new faces. 16 people who did not yet know what they were capable of and who would leave 16 days from now knowing more of it than they had imagined. She walked out into the evening. The bay was dark and wide, the lights of Coronado scattered on the water, the air carrying the smell of salt and the distant sound of the bass and the closer sound of her own footsteps on the path. She walked the way she always walked, steadily, at the pace that covered ground without urgency and without hesitation. Her father's daughter, her father's hands, both of them, steady,